This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, welcome everybody. It's a huge pleasure to welcome the 2016 ST Lee Professor at the School of Advanced Study, particularly since it's Greg Crane, who's, they say needs no introduction. Greg is known to classicists as the founder of Perseus and much else, pioneered the field of digital classics at Tufts, and for some years now has also been the Humboldt Chair of Digital Humanities in the University of Leipzig. And this is a perfect job for Greg because more or less what the job seems to be involves networking and running the network, isn't it? And running around the world and connecting up people in an emerging discipline. And I can't imagine anybody who is fonder of collecting air miles than Greg in this respect. And so we're very glad to have. He's actually getting train miles for the next 3 weeks running around the UK. Because one of the things about the ST Lee Fellowship is that it's designed not just for events in London, but to take the message out further afield. And so, although he's starting with the event here today, for which you're gathered, and we'll come back to London for the Digital Classicist Seminar on the 3rd of June. In the interim, he's going to be speaking in Glasgow, in Oxford, a couple of talks in Oxford, Manchester, Durham, and I expect other people on the way. The ST Lee Fellows are funded through the generosity of a Singaporean benefactor, Dr Lee Seng Tee, who is Honorary Fellow of the British Academy. He's given various gifts supporting higher education, and he's created, he funds a research centre inside Senate House Libraries. So, as always, we thank him and his foundation for their generosity. But particularly we thank Greg for coming and kicking off on Greek, Latin, digital philology in a global age. And what we're going to do is Greg is going to speak for a while, presenting some themes, some ideas, some provocations. And then we're lucky to have 4 respondents who will speak in the following order. Dr Imre Galambos from Cambridge, Professor Eleanor Robson, who you'll know from UCL, Dr Sarah Savant from the Aga Khan University, and Dr Sam van Schaik from the British Library. And they're each going to have their words, and then we'll just go informal, and at some point the informality will be dissolved into alcohol. But first of all, Greg, we look forward to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to give you information overload in 20 minutes. We'll see how well this works. So I will talk in my American fashion too quickly, but my Northeast American. So I'm going to talk about Greek, Latin, and digital philology in a global age. And basically the idea is that I can't believe people still use the term classics as if it were synonymous with Greek and Latin. And the fact that we do not have demonstrations against this, at least in the United States, where we demonstrate about everything, is actually kind of depressing, because it means it's a club nobody cares they're not part of. But I think that we need to rethink how we imagine cultural heritage in a rather different way. I will say, first of all, because I'm, I guess, required always to say this, I am the Alexander von Humboldt Professor. I'm always corrected when I say humble, of digital humanities. And this is a professorship, basically it's designed to buy German professors from Southern California and get them back home. And every year there's a bycatch of an American or a Brit or two who gets pulled in. And I was one of them 1 year. But I am here enhancing Germany's sustained international competitiveness as a research location in consequence of the award. It's a prize, but this is what I'm supposed to do with my prize. And so Germany is mein Lebenszentrum. I am a permanent resident of Germany, and I am quite literally, as they used to say, a paid agent of a foreign power. So I am obligated to advance the interests of Germany. Luckily, advancing the interests of digital humanities or the humanities in Germany is not like advancing the German weapons industry or even helping BMW put poor GM workers out of work. It is so I feel it's not a zero-sum game, so it's not a problem. And part of what I'll allude to is that I do hope that Germany will be helpful in building infrastructure for historical languages. And there's conversations pointing in that direction. Nothing is certain until it checks clear, but good things could happen. So I come here with US, German, and European perspectives. I gave a talk last year in Canada about the US and Germany, and one Canadian person was outraged that I didn't talk about how great Canada was. I'll warn you up front, I hope you will tell me how great the UK is. And I'm interested in your perspectives, British perspectives, English perspectives. There'll be Scottish perspectives later this week, and we'll see what perspectives there are in about a month, 6 weeks or so. And I'm not going to say what I think about that because my president got in all sorts of trouble. But I think my president's really smart. I'll just start by saying, what is philology? Here's my answer. All of you, I'm sure every one of you can read that quickly. That was what August Birk, when he was rector of the university, used to give, or to, one of the burdens of being king of Prussia was you had to hear August Birk give a Latin oration every year on your birthday. But here is a famous quotation that I heard in 1975 when I was a freshman, that philology is the philologia, is the cognitio universa antiquitatis cognitio historica and philosophica, which I interpret to mean philology is about anything, is the use of language to reconstruct anything that happened in the human mind, how I understand philosophica, and anything that happened out in the world. It's the use of textual data as broadly as possible. It is not just doing critical editions, although that is a part of this task. It is anything you can do with text. That is, and I will claim that's what Birk thought, because he's not around to contradict him. And so philology, again, is defined by goals, not by methods. So there's people still say, oh, it's so cute that you use technology when you're studying ancient Greece. And we do anything that is going to allow us to get more out of the textual record. It doesn't matter what it is. Just like the archaeologists do botany and chemistry and so on. So there is no protection in saying these are our skills, this is our field. The field goes as methods emerge. And that philology is relentlessly data-driven. For me, the essence of the philological mindset is you make a statement, and here is your evidence. Now, you may argue about the evidence and interpret it differently, but that's my evidence right here, and let's have a conversation. And I, as a graduate student in classics, I work with what we call this huge, not just multi-volume, like an entire bookcase, encyclopedia, Polyvasova, and you still look at these articles 100 years later because they've got all the primary sources in there. And it's quite thorough, and to me, that is what constitutes philology. Philology, you get into the data, and you get as deep as you can, and you're never as deep as you want to be. There's always more to learn. And philology, means a lot to me because my professional association started as the American Philological Association, then they decided they would improve themselves, and then they became the Society for Classical Studies, an organization designed solely to advance the interests of professional American classicists, now treats itself as the Society for Classical Studies in the world, typical American. Yes, we are the world. Is there anything else? And then the idea of classical studies, which I'll get to. But, it's easy for people to say, oh, these old books, it's all out of date, we don't really care, blah, blah, blah. Well, philology, people working with ancient texts may not, are effective in all sorts of good and bad ways. Here's one group. probably the most prominent philologists in action. Now you can say these are crazy philologists, but these are people making arguments based upon interpretation of ancient language, horrible arguments, actually, but based upon reading of primary sources. The only argument, ultimately, in the long run, against evil speech is more speech. You may end up using military means out of necessity, but that's not going to solve the problem in the long run. And I think we see it also just in a less dire situation. Here is the PolitiFact analysis of statements by President Obama, who I think probably tries to be as accurate as anybody. He's criticized for being a schoolmaster, and so you've got to give him at least that. By contrast, let us hope, one of the two candidates probably for President of the United States, when you actually analyze what he says, 2% of what he says is true, and 26% is pants on fire false. 18%, more than 61% of what comes out of his mouth is not true. And yet he's tremendously successful. And this is kind of baffling and depressing. I think this is our failure. It is the failure of those of us who are philologists to communicate the importance of comparing statements with whatever their evidence is. You may argue about the evidence, but at least there's got to be evidence somewhere. And the ability of just complete, a certain kind of empty rhetoric to be so successful, I take personally. And so people think we don't have anything to do. I think we have a lot to do. Philology is pretty central. All right. Now I'm going to talk about three basic reasons for global philology. There'll be a social, political, economic dimension. There's an intellectual dimension, and there's a pragmatic dimension. Of course, I'm in Germany, so pragmatic will win the day. But economic and social context, really, how do you understand your cultural heritage, whatever country you're in a global context? Now, there are really practical reasons for this. Here, for example, a visualization of exports. And you can see in the United States why the United States has been trying to turn to Asia for 15 years to get away from the Middle East. Never seems to work. But it's pretty hard for me to ignore classical Chinese, given the way our economy is set up. And you can sort of see how we're situated. You can see, this is Germany, my other home. And it's pretty clear where we are oriented. And it's kind of amazing, actually, how similar the UK is in terms of its economic connectivity. I was kind of shocked to see the general picture being much the same. But this is going to influence, to some extent, how your society thinks about the world, because it's influenced in part by who you do business with. In Germany, our job is to sell everything to everybody, and which Germany does an incredible job. The Germans export almost exactly the same as 320 Americans. 320 million Americans, so it's amazing. It's not all trade and economics. And here are some population statistics that really shocked me in kind of a good way in the United States. So I guess if I live to be 100 and something, there'll be someone paying my Social Security as our population is actually going up. Which I didn't think was going to happen in this way. And interestingly, in the next 50 years, there will be no ethnic majority in the United States. Now, of course, the way we think about ethnicities changes. My ancestors were French, Irish, and English, and they cheerfully hated each other and killed each other. Now they're all lumped in together as sort of white Europeans. But what is Greek and Latin going to look like in the United States, at least, when only a minority of the country is considered white? Now, Hispanic has speaking Spanish, is a little more complicated, but we have a different kind of society that's being fashioned. My department, we teach ancient China, we teach Sanskrit, we have a person who works with Greco-Arabic, classical Arabic, so we really have worked to transform our conception of classics. But that's not something we've done as a field. So here in the US, we've got to think about how do we fashion our conception of cultural heritage to reflect a really global population. Asian, I should say, includes this Indian subcontinent. It's everybody. It's like everybody west of the Bosphorus, east of the Bosphorus. Germany, we have the problem that, however you cut it, we either lose a bunch of people or a whole lot of people. So the good news is there'll be more Englishmen or more people in the UK, if there is a UK, in 50 years than there are Germans. If you call that good news. So there's population decline. This is the figure if you have good immigration, high immigration. This is without immigration. So this is a real problem for a country like Germany. And so the challenge is, if you do not have enough people, you have to bring people in, and they're not all coming from Europe. And they're not always all going to come from Syria. How do you think about creating a society which people feel like they're a part? And it's going to be different from what exists in Germany. It's not for me to say. I'm sort of there as a visitor, as a friendly visitor, but this is an interesting question. What is your cultural heritage going to look like? In the UK, your population is actually going up, and it's actually going up. This is only a 25-year projection, but it goes up about 15% in the next 25 years, so it's probably comparable to the US, maybe a little behind. Of course, and interestingly, it's all here in the South. Most of it, England is getting most of the increase. Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland are pretty flat. They're increasing a little bit, but by about half as much. And of course, immigration is coming largely from, increase is coming largely from immigration. So again, you already have a fairly diverse population. What do you do about that? How do you create a conception of yourself, of national identity that is open to many different points of view? And so I think, again, if you just do Greek and Latin, I don't think it's going to work very well. I think if you do Greek and Latin with everything else, Greek and Latin benefit as well. And so you have all sorts of issues back. My other home in Germany, if Chancellor Merkel talks about multiculti, if I said multiculti in the United States in English, I'd probably lose tenure. It would be such this would be so disrespectful. Multiculti is total gescheitert worden, or whatever, but she can get away with it. And so the question is, how do you fashion a culture that is able both to understand the outside world with which you are interacting in real time, and also to integrate people from different historical and cultural backgrounds into a more interesting and kind of cooler environment. So this is what sells things with governments. The second topic, of course, is intellectual motivations. And I just illustrate this with something that just happened to me this morning. I got up really early, and I went to YouTube and said, I'm going to listen to some music while I'm thinking about this talk. And I got this screen, a screen of symphonies by composers, most of whom I'd never heard of, or music I never heard. I think we have also Arthur Sullivan, one of his symphonies, which I've looked for in the past. I'm not sure I'm going to listen to it again, but nevertheless, this is an instance of what's called one of the most important phenomena, which is the long tail. Now, the long tail is comes from marketing. In the old days, when you had a brick and mortar bookstore, you were fascinated with bestsellers because a brick and mortar bookstore has expensive real estate. There's only so many books you can put in there. And you have sort of a self-fulfilling a system where only the highest selling books make it into that bookstore. And if you grew up reading Greek and Latin as I did, you learned that none of your texts were in the bookstore you ever went to. But when you have infinite inventory, people actually don't just read bestsellers. The orange represents sales, these book by book, unit by unit, And red, these are the best sellers. These are the long tail or the smaller sellers. The things that are not popular are just as important, or sell just as much or just as valued as the best sellers. And so this is fundamentally different kind of intellectual ecology. And you see this with Netflix, you see it with iTunes, you see it with Amazon books, and you're going to see it with Greek and Latin. As we fill in the long tail of Greek and Latin texts, the other 80 million words that we haven't added, besides the top 20 million words. So, these symphonies by people, some of them I have to admit I never heard of, represent the long tail showing up as sort of intellectual capacity. So there I have all these symphonies. What the hell do I do? So what? So I go to Google, and this is pretty amazing by itself. I mean, this is what you do. You type in this guy's name, you get Wikipedia entry, which is incredibly useful, and you start to get into academic articles about it, and it's actually pretty astonishing that much. But I'm sorry, it's still not good enough. It's not good enough, not close to being good enough. It's not. I want to understand how Roth's music relates to Bruckner, Mahler, and other contemporaries. I want to understand the full cultural context. Is this guy driven by German or Austrian, or he's Austrian? So it's is there this sort of nationalist agenda there? What's going on? I want to know, and again, if I read an article, I want to see the data behind every goddamn statement, and that doesn't, and it includes, this person's he's midway between Bruckner and Mahler. Well, give me the music. I want to see the music. I want to hear exactly what you're talking about. And I want evidence that that's significant. I want to frame my own questions, and I want to apply these questions to the data itself, and I want to be able to think rationally about the results that come out. I want an environment where I am able to interpret what I see. This is what I want here, and this is what we're building or trying to build for Greek and Latin, and hoping to see built for other languages as well. And this impulse of trying to go beyond what your local capacity allows you to do is ubiquitous in academia. Here, for example, the Stanford Ancient Chinese and Mediterranean Empires Comparative History Project. I would doubt that very many people among the esteemed Stanford colleagues are actually able to read classical Chinese and classical Greek and Latin and Coptic and Syriac and Old Persian and all the other cool languages that you would want to work with. How do you get past, depending upon what some other professor says in a textbook, in an article, or even a translation? Or here, a class I wish I could have taken, dear to my heart, Ancient Warfare, Assyrian. Okay, I've already exhausted my 20 minutes, but I go on a little further. The Assyrian and Greek perspectives taught by Karen Radner and Hans van Wies in this city. How many of the people in that class were able to read the Akkadian, the Assyrian, and the Greek? Probably somebody, I hope, but not enough, and not well enough, and not as well as I'm sure as they would like to.
Only undergraduates.
Pardon me?
Only undergrads.
Oh. Or Arabic, again, old Greco-Arabic, a major area, or Arabic into Latin. Hardly anybody works from the Arabic into Latin. Hardly anybody has the languages. It's really hard to do. And then world literature, which just makes my head explode. The idea that we encounter world literature, and of course we do it in English. And the Anglophone world, we don't even think that's odd. Or a problem because we live in our English bubbles. Okay, so how do you deal with these languages? So I think that one thing is, I think we need to the linguists have been dealing with things like intensive annotation for a long time. The linguists are used to dealing with hundreds of languages or thousands of languages, knowing they'll never study those languages. There are too many of them. And so they come up with mechanisms whereby they have such intensive annotation they can do something with it. I know this is not like reading Greek for 10 years and memorizing and immersing yourself with it. But it's better than reading an English translation. It gets you into the language. And these are the Leipzig glossing rules, nothing to do with us, we just happen to be there. And this approach has been applied to ancient Egyptian. I'm not sure how much they've actually gotten done, but the idea is, where I grew up, if you couldn't read Greek or Latin properly without a dictionary, then you really shouldn't be reading Greek or Latin, really, because you're not worthy. It's the sort of, and now I think my job, the smartest people, the people who are really smart in Greek and Latin, all of their work should go into making it possible for people who do not know Greek and Latin to get as deeply into the language as possible. It's a complete opposite, flipped polarity. And because there are not enough people who understand the language. So here, now the problem is this is manual, this is hard to do, but you can do a lot of this automatically more or less well. This hideous looking thing is part of a tree bank. This is the syntactic structure of a sentence. And it's similar to linguistic data. If you look here, this is morphology is in here, I didn't show it. But you get the morphology, and you get the syntax, and corresponding to the word-by-word translations, we now have aligned translations, where we have the capacity to create, the old interlinear translations I always looked down upon when I was a kid. We had the Greek and Latin, but who are immensely useful in a digital form because you can see how words are translated differently, and you can use them as reading tools. And here's a visualization of the Greek lined up with the Arabic translation and the Arabic with the corresponding Greek lined up. At this level of granularity, it's done manually. You can do about 80% automatically if you have a big parallel corpus. So if you have the ability to line up a translation word for word, and then you have the ability to figure out the grammatical function of every word in a sentence, you can do a hell of a lot with a language that you have not even studied, if you know what you're doing. Part of what we have to do is teach people how to do this. So fundamentally, we start, traditionally, this is our space, Greek, Latin, English, French, German, Italian, and that we've worked with as Greco-Roman people, and this is what we really want to work with at a global scale in 200 BCE, or whenever we're working. And the challenge here is language, and global philology thinks about how we can work with more languages than the human brain was designed to learn. All right, and I'll just finish up very quickly. Practical issues. First of all, we need a software infrastructure, and it's expensive. So the mean annual wage of a developer in the United States, a software developer, is $100,000, or was $100,000. That's for your average person working in a bank. And the problem is that the kind of work we do is harder than the work you get paid $100,000 a year for, because it requires more understanding of these really crazy disciplines. Even in Germany, where they have a lot of money, they don't have money for developers. And your reviewers say things like, oh, full-time developer, that seems rich for my blood. How about a half-time student to do your software? This is how you go broke spending money, by always spending never enough and never spending enough money to do things that are reusable. So there are typical categories of development. First thing that we're all familiar with, all of us are working digital project, is project-oriented code. You get $5,000 to do a website. You get just enough money to hire somebody to do something for your project that works for your project. And that person is gone later. And woe upon you if you need to fix it or update it. It's not in the budget. But this is really useful. We do this. It's the only way you can go forward. It's the way that we're set up. A second category of work is research code. And this, for example, I wrote a program to analyze Greek morphology 30 years ago that's still not been replaced. Even I don't understand it fully, but it works pretty well. But it's not sustainable code. It's this big black box that I can sort of fix and hopefully be replaced. But it's got to be replaced if you're going to have the ability to analyze Greek sustainably. And finally, there's reusable code. And reusable code is when a real software engineer, somebody who knows what they're doing, sits down and writes in a way that some other human being can understand who has never met them. The hard thing is to build a system that can be maintained over time, which means someone leaves and ceases to be in contact. The next developer, 5 years later, walks in and reads the code and understands how it was done and is able to change it or rewrite it. That is expensive. That's really hard. One figure, 40 years old, classic Fred Brooks, Mythical Man Month, is it's 3 times as expensive, 3 times as much work to do the code right as it is just to do it once. 25% of labor is to get the code to run, and then another 3 times as much work. 75% of the work is running it, doing it right. And then finally, infrastructure. We need infrastructure. Infrastructure is when third parties like libraries take on tasks that were done by projects or individuals. And until you get to the infrastructure stage, we're always reinventing the wheel. We're always doing service level work. We want to do research. And I think we're at the stage where we have a lot of, we can point to collections, we can point to services in a bunch of fields that are really useful, and that they should be sustained. They're at the point to graduate where somebody other than the professors will take care of them. I've been trying to get the Perseus Digital Library off my back for 15 years, waiting for someone else to run it, and we're not quite there yet. So one of the questions is, how do we build an infrastructure? And I'll say there are 2 reasons to build an infrastructure. First, you don't want to build, a pipeline for analyzing language by yourself for every damn language. It's too expensive. And a lot of what we do is, in fact, has a language-independent component, and it has a language-dependent component. Your topic modeling, your parallel text analysis works pretty well with any language, but it helps to have a morphological analyzer that's only going to work for your language. That's got to be written for your particular language. So there is a sort of practical, pragmatic reason why we need infrastructural development, because we want to get more done and we don't have enough money to do it ourselves. And there's an intellectual reason, because we want to be able to look at Greek and Arabic, or we want to be able to look at cool ideas that show up in more languages than we can learn, and we want environments that will enhance our ability to work with multiple languages. And there's also finally sort of a larger sociological thing. We need to be able to think in terms of more than just Greek and Latin in Europe and North America if we're going to understand our function in the world, and if we're going to deal with increasingly global populations, or populations that interact globally in a different way. And so the question is, what do we do about it? How do we go forward? And what's next? And so at this point, I'll leave it to the various people to comment. Unfortunately, probably no one's going to be outraged that I'm saying we shouldn't just do Greek and Latin. But anyway, so.
Great, thank you very much. Now, we've picked our discussants because they have such different experiences and different linguistic knowledges and so on. So I hope all a common area of interest in this. But we'd love to hear what you think. Imre, would you like to start us off?
Yes. So thank you very much for the interesting and sort of enlightening talk. You finished it with the words that how do we move forward, and let's hear it from us. Like, I don't know how we should move forward. Actually, to say that at the very beginning, I work on Chinese, and I actually myself come from sort of a digital background. When I was a graduate student, I worked as a programmer analyst, and so this is how I was hired at the British Library for the same project Sam is still working on, and I did 10 years there before I got a job at Cambridge to teach pre-modern Chinese language and culture. So when we say that Greek and Latin are what people understand on the classics, That is true. We have the Faculty of Classics, which is next to us, and we are the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. So we're 20 meters apart, but we do completely different things, and we do classical Chinese, but that's not included under classics. So in a way, it feels odd today, but I have to say also that the Chinese made the same assumptions. So for most of their history, the Chinese didn't consider the rest of the world. So they thought that they were in the center, and what differentiated them from other peoples was that they had a written language, they had the classics, and they knew how to read them, and everyone else around China was pretty much different. So they didn't read Chinese. And what languages they wrote, or what languages they spoke, the Chinese always never talked about this because they were not interested. So it wasn't Chinese. And obviously, even within China, people spoke different languages, but they all wrote the same language, the same written language. So, and that's the language of culture. That's what separates things today. And this, so basically, this literacy that existed in China was contrasted with barbarians outside of China. So in a way, it's parallel with our modern understanding of the classics. Of course, this dichotomy is still present because if you're in China, you go on the web, you cannot get access to the rest of the world. You cannot use Google, so you're closed in. It's a huge world within China, enormous, probably as big as the internet outside of China, but it's not really well connected. As for the digitization thing, I always felt, well, since I was doing I was employed by similar kinds of projects that were aiming at digitizing, digitizing the humanities, I always felt that there was this digitization fetish, where, especially back in those days, in the the late 1990s, it was always exciting to see your text on the screen, on a computer screen. So we can type it in, it's wow. And then later on, we have a photograph, wow, it's even more interesting. But we never really went beyond that. And I think that still exists today. And one of the challenges to move forward is to find digital technology to be used for something meaningful and something to add value to things. Obviously, there are projects, very worthwhile projects in different universities and research centers, but if you look on the web in general, you get over-flooded by sort of very basic things. If I look for my snippet of text from the text I'm working on, I get 5 billion hits, and it's very hard to find out which is the good one, because they're different and many of them are mistaken, and these get repeated by, obviously, not by humans, but people write code to generate more pages so they get indexed and so forth. So we're being burdened by this to a large extent through Google. So it would be very interesting to see projects that allow us to move forward, basically, and to do something useful. So what you've described, this level of attention, no matter how expensive it is, it's obviously something that we should, not consider. That's something we should use, and this is one of the directions we should go on. But how to do it, I'm not sure. So I'll pass on the microphone to someone else.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Eleanor.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm a cuneiformist. I work on the linguistic ancient heritage of Syria and Iraq. I first met Greg nearly 20 years ago, you don't doubt if you remember, in Oxford. I've been involved in the creation of digital tools for text written in the cuneiform script for nearly 20 years, over 20 years now. And I currently am one of the co-founders of a big international consortium called the ORAC, the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus, which has been aiming for the past 10 years or so to do these sorts of things that Greg talks about with no money and no infrastructure. So a lot of what you say, Greg, I relate to absolutely, and we're somewhere in between sort of bullet point 2 and bullet point 3 there on your list of development. A couple of issues that you didn't flag up, though I'm sure, I know time is limited and I'm sure you're aware of. Imre raised too, quality control. How do we help users make sense of this material and make choices about what to use and how to use it? The second is a question of accessibility. If we want philology to be truly global, then it's not just the source languages we need to be thinking about, it's the target languages and the accessibility of tools and networks to deliver that. So I work a lot in Iraq, in southern Iraq, where colonial history and the past decades of war means that I have a far better control over the ancient languages of Iraq than any of my Iraqi colleagues. And that's fundamentally morally problematic. And one of my big missions is to, behind online resourcing of this stuff, is to get not only the data, but the tools and into Arabic to enable colleagues and students to access it on devices and that they have and over very slow and intermittent networks. But there's also a related issue there, which I think perhaps we come at the idea of the very pragmatic questions that you put in very straightforward terms of population, trade and economics, and that is a lot of the cultural heritage of the Middle East are basically dead or disowned cultures, and there isn't a simple linkage between modern population size or interest and particularly political control and their importance for global history. So how we manage that and how we enable and stimulate access to heritage which may be at its most benign seem to be irrelevant, but perhaps in some places of the world it even seem to be dangerous or threatening to some current regime. So those are some issues I want to throw out there. But just to sum up, say that that was a fantastically compact and succinct agenda that I wholeheartedly subscribe to, and I'm really glad that you're raising this issue. I say as someone who has no Greek or Latin whatsoever.
So I guess before we go on, I have a comment. First of all, next week we're going to Oxford. I think my title is, global editions and why they matter. In other words, you have to think in terms of people in China at least having the prospect of reading this stuff if they feel like it, or Indonesia. And it's not, how do you design these texts so that they can circulate? We have Latin introductions to our editions. That's not really to be mean to you. That's because you learned one language in Europe and everybody learned Latin. It was, if not democratizing, it was a cosmopolitan exercise. And I think that one of the great shifts, and I'm kind of mournful about it, is that in the shift of culture, is that 40 years ago when I was a freshman, first year student, it was clear that I had to try to master English, French, German, Italian. There were 4 languages, and those are our languages, and I worked on them. If I were 40 years younger, I might still pick English, French, German, Italian, but I'm not sure. And 10 years from now, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't. It's going to be some other configuration. I would say Arabic, English, Chinese, or Mandarin, and Spanish. If I had to pick 4, would be a pretty good bet. And that's good for us Anglophones because our brains are rotting because it's too easy to do everything in English. But it's a different configuration. And would be very good for us if we thought that way. Just as, when 19th century American culture, when we participate in this high European culture from across the Atlantic was a beautiful thing then. It was very cosmopolitan, but this is sort of the next step. So I totally agree with you on that. And I just say Arak is, the Assyriologists have done a fabulous job of organizing their data and getting and working together and moving forward. You have another Humboldt professor, Karen Radner, who is now determined to push things along, and it is her, she is, I would say, the primary participant or collaborator in Germany, where I hope we're going to get some support from the German BMBF, at the very least to get the Assyriological cuneiform and the Greek and Latin material interacting in some productive way. And I'm just so, Karen Radner is even more radical than I am. She's awesome. And talks like, power to the people and everything. But Assyriology has done a fabulous job. It's been 30 years since I worked in cuneiform, and I'm just so happy to see all the work that's happening.
Should we head off from Sarah?
Okay.
Sarah
Good. So I should say I work in Arabic and Persian, and I know Greg because I run a project called Khattab, which stands for Knowledge, Information, Technology, and the Arabic Book. And Khattab is the Arabic word for book, so it's a very handy acronym. Greg's been the project's probably biggest supporter / provider of people who have real skills that we need in terms of partners. So he's been very important to the project, which has been running now without funding for 2 years, and we're now deep in the process of, I interview, I think it's safe to say, next month on the 22nd of June in Brussels, the day before Brexit, so it'll be interesting.
The day before you find out, you maybe move,
Right.
yes.
I assume the Horizon 2020 funding is cloistered and set aside. Let's hope. And I hope we are successful. It's our second time trying to get funding. In any event, I'm just like a couple of kind of maybe reactions, thoughts. It's interesting, this point of classics. I think this is a topic that it always seems to arise, when you work with Arabic and Persian. I started working in Sanskrit when I was a graduate student as well. And it's the Library of Arabic Literature, which is producing this kind of, a sort of English with parallel-facing Arabic texts series, and I'm a translator for one of these books, has eschewed in the introductions that we write the term classical. So I had written the word, in the classical Arabic tradition, blah, 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 in my introduction, and the editors struck it. Oh. And they said, well, on the grounds of da-da-da-da, we really reject this term. Which I thought was interesting because, we're producing, on the one hand, this kind of authoritative, semi-authoritative collection of books that are meant to be used in classrooms to broaden what's available for users, and there's been a whole selection process on what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, for the series, etc. And yet, we can't own up to the fact of the term classical in any sense, or even problematize it. And I would have been fine if someone said, can you please, provide a thoughtful discussion of the term classical. But instead, we're just avoiding. I would suggest that's an avoidance. But it seemed a little bit long of a comment, little comment section on your PDF documents that you're supposed to send back, in a week, to bother to raise that issue. In any event, for the classical Arabic tradition, if I may say, just a couple of points. The issue of this, I think I love your division, Greg, and of the three categories. And to speak to two of them, maybe the social, political, and economic. Firstly, what we're doing, so I'm part of Khattab, the PI for Khattab. I'm also part of a very new project called the Islamicate Text Initiative, the ITI. And we're trying to, our aim is to put together, a proper corpus for Arabic and Persian. Because even though we've got, this enormous textual tradition, and we have all of these digital libraries that are all over the world, and we have these sort of ad hoc projects that are, transcribing from manuscripts, etc., there's no single standard collection of texts. There's no place even to have a sort of discussion about how do we create uniform standards. It's an incredibly chaotic situation considering the potential of this enormous body of material. If we want to say, we have now in our collection, which Maxim Romanov has been working on, another one of Greg's people, He's brought together 7,800 unique Arabic texts from the period of 750 to 1600, and these are all available online, in digital open access sources. So there's quite a lot of text. It's somewhere between, he's not quite sure, between 1 billion words, 1.5 billion words. So it's an enormous body of material that's available. Now, the question, though, of how do we fashion, to go to your phrasing, how do we fashion our sense of global heritage is incredibly important when you're looking at the creation of a corpus, right? Because why do these actual texts exist? They're a fraction of what's actually been printed over history, and what's been printed is even, a fraction of what exists in manuscripts, and what exists in manuscripts is a fraction of what once existed, So you've got this kind of really very, very selective process. And we can also mention that all the editions that exist, who are the editors, the reprinting processes in the Middle East are a nightmare. So what do you actually have, of the 7,800 books? And when you think about adding to that, that's when you suddenly find yourselves engaged with these questions of global heritage. If you want to think of the fact that so many of these, digital products, we can call them, were produced by Sunni kind of agendas working with religious motives, or Shi'i on the opposite side. But there's very little in these collections of works that I would like to work with as a cultural historian. So it's a problem. I mean, it's just to say this issue of a corpus is an enormous problem, and the mechanisms for developing it have not even been developed. So when we look at a project like Perseus, or when we think about the Greek and Latin classics, I think it's very important actually that we engage meaningfully with notions of what's classical, because it provides a terminology, in fact, for thinking about these issues critically in terms of authority. Principally, I'd say, and my project deals with text reuse specifically, Khattab, and how books were copied over time. So if we want to think about what's been copied, we have to be able to see it. We have to have it in digital format, and any other way of operating the project really makes no sense. In terms of pragmatic, and this is also related to the chaotic situation of our sources, in the digital humanities, what I'm finding, and I hope I'm wrong, is that we face a big problem, which is that there's a big move now from funding agencies to say, well, we want infrastructure, we don't want corpus projects. So we want infrastructure, which is all nice and fine and good if you got in the game early, But if you're getting in the game late, we have to find a way to define a corpus as infrastructure, basically. That finding sort of ways of talking around the problem to say, well, actually, we're creating the space to discuss how you do these projects. We're creating opportunities for repurposing. The repurposing word is frequent, in the way we're framing the project. I think one of the it would be helpful, let's say, to those who have been in the game early, maybe for Chinese as well, I don't know, to have a language about infrastructure, that is useful for other projects, because it's a real impediment if you're trying to find funding, and funding is essential, of course. That's probably enough. I think we'll probably have more questions and discussion.
So let me pick up on that, on that last element. So I didn't talk about the thing which has absorbed most of my energy for the last 10 years, which I now would call open Greek and Latin. Our problem with Greek and Latin isn't that things haven't been digitized. Our problem is that they have been digitized and privatized. So if you try to download and repurpose and share Greek texts that have been digitized, a letter will come from an American university, from the lawyers at an American university. It won't come to your work address, it comes to your home address, threatening you with a lawsuit. And if you have to defend the lawsuit yourself, it's $50,000 of your own money, $50,000 of your own. The idea is to destroy you as a human being if you reuse those texts. That comes from the university. And if you can't, but a definition of a real digital classicist starts when you know you have to take the goddamn text, download it, do something to it, and repurpose it and give it away again, or it's not scholarship. You just can't work. So we had to, 5 years ago, I was in the UK. I remember on trains working on bad OCR, trying to clean up text to painfully expand the amount of stuff that was available. I had like no money to do it. Because we have to have the texts. You do not have the text, you cannot do scholarship. End. Stop, period. Done. If you don't have open text, you do not have a field in the modern world. You do not have a fully functioning field. I don't want to say or exaggerate too much, but to function fully in the digital world, you need data that you can analyze, mark up, change, modify, and give away. That's just absolutely fundamental. And so I can't support you say enough. I mean, I didn't talk about it today because we managed to get enough money so we'll have all of Greek literature from 300 CE done. And I have a hope that the DFG will finish everything up through 600 CE and I'll be done with that corpus, finally, after 20 years. But there's a lot of books I didn't write, a lot of interesting work I haven't done because I was supervising tagging up texts that have been digitized already. So that's my rant about that. Okay. So, and I'll just say we have interesting cases. The good thing about working Greek and Latin is if I can digitize off Greek and Latin, nobody's going to get up and effectively call me an evil imperialist. There are some people from Greece or Italy who may try. I don't care. I'm sorry, it doesn't matter. But I know my friend, Shelley Pollack, the Sanskrit expert, gets creamed every so often for being the white guy talking about Sanskrit when he's in India. And I suspect other people have run into this in the past. But with Chinese, you have a big country that's very centralized and very conscious of itself. Arabic is cheerfully disorganized. There's all sorts of countries. So there's no single locus of power. They may kill you, but you can sort of do stuff without a single proprietor coming after you. And then you have, as Eleanor just described, cuneiform, and nobody's like the stepchildren. Isn't anybody's cultural heritage in the same way. So we have 4 different kinds of cases. The Greek and Latin are useful because we can experiment with it, we can give them away, and no one's going to come after us, outside of Europe.
Sam?
Yes, okay, well, I'll be quick. But just actually picking up from what you said, working with Chinese manuscripts at the British Library is interesting. I've been working on a project that's been going since the mid-90s, so it was early in the game, and is still going to digitise this collection of manuscripts from the Silk Road, which ended up in the British Library through expeditions during the colonial kind of period of the early 20th century. And because of that kind of colonial competition, this kind of like an early version of the space race, but it was a kind of manuscript race, the collections ended up all over the world. And the project, the kind of inception of the project was curators coming together from different museums and saying, we've got to talk about this, we've all got this same material, and as it was the sort of beginning of the internet era, it was decided to make a website, and then that developed into the idea of putting images of everything online together. And one of the kind of saving graces of this, I think, was that China, Beijing also had a big collection, and they came on fairly early as well. So the National Library in Beijing was an early partner, and that relationship has always been very good. So it's interestingly on that kind of level, this kind of level of scholars, we're all interested in classical Chinese texts, classical again, and so we work very well. There's kind of interesting political pressures that come to play every now and then that feel like they're coming from quite high up in the world of Chinese politics, and then sort of squashed down on scholars. And then you see things said. So, for example, just yesterday or today, there was an interview with the head of the Dunhuang Academy in China, and he said something rather sort of nice. We're in the world's one big family. We hope all these manuscripts will come back together to where they belong. And I think, well, I guess that's kind of vague enough. Who knows when the world will be one big family again? But it's certainly an interesting. So these things sort of as you said, and of course we've got to be aware of this. Our collections in Europe do come out of this colonial context, and in this post-colonial world, we have to grapple with that. And I think one of the things we can do, at least kind of ethically, is, as you say, put the stuff out there for free. The best thing you can do is make everything available. We've got decades, as much as a century or more, of looking after this stuff, conserving it. So we have some claim to say, well, we've made a very nice place for it here. Why don't we keep it? But if we are going to say that, at least we've got to make it possible for anybody who wants to see it, whether if they come in person or if they just want to go onto the website, to let them do that. And the other point I think that arises from that is that the colonial background of our subject is part of the reason for its kind of the difficulties that it faces. So the study of Sanskrit and I guess Greek is kind of included in this to some extent as well. Comes from people going to these places and ripping up stones and manuscripts and whatever, and bringing them back and studying them, and we've all benefited from that. And that kind of study was part of the glory of these European countries. And now there's less of an interest in that. We're kind of embarrassed about the colonial past, quite rightly. And we now have new ideologies, this kind of neoliberal, business-driven ideology, which, in which the study of dead languages doesn't sit very well. So I mean, this is fairly obvious, but this is the struggle that a lot of higher education institutions and our search for funding runs up against. So it's interesting, we've just got some major funding from the ERC, the European Research Council, for a project based on the Asia and the Gupta period, which is the 4th to 6th century, using mainly Sanskrit sources. And we got one of 3 PIs in this project. We got a significant amount of funding alongside mainly kind of microbiologists and particle physicists. And I think one of the reasons was that the EU people liked the idea that we were looking at this big region of Asia beyond regional studies, beyond single language studies, and beyond the kind of local nationalist discourses that you often get around these sources. So I don't know what really that tells us, but there's interesting kind of stories to be told around if you sort of look beyond regional, specific areas of traditional areas of regional study and incorporating kind of more sources, more languages into the story, and kind of, maybe you'll get funding. We did. So I scribbled lots of notes here. I don't know if any of the other ones are relevant, but just one more thing. It's interesting to talk about text, particularly the transcription of text. I think it's always worth remembering in the limits of digitization that when people look at a transcription, they're looking at something that's been extracted from the actual object, that it's a lot of information has been lost, and there's a lot of things that you can't say about the object. They're better when you have a very nice high-quality digital image, but even then, it's still only standing in for a physical object, and that object, was created by somebody, used for a purpose, had its own kind of agency and story, and so we've got to remember that we have kind of, when we're putting just text online, we're leaving a lot of stuff behind as well. So we'll finish.
Sam, thank you very much. Craig, do you want to respond to that before we sort of...
So first of all, I think I totally agree in the last comment you made, and I think that and I don't have a vocabulary to describe a change in value or realizable potential value of what happens when you have amazing access to text-bearing artifacts online. And for many purposes, you see them better than you would if you were in the archive, in Venice, for example. Fabulous visualization of the most important Homer manuscript, for example. And that changes the role that these objects can play in intellectual life. For all the people who say, "Oh, I want my books. I want to feel up my books and smell them," no one has ever said, "Don't take away my microfiche reader or my microfilm reader, and I want to look at my black and white microfilms of manuscripts." I have never heard anyone say that. I think most people prefer what we've got. The most important project I've seen that I know of is a thing called the Homer Multitext Project, because they're publishing this crazy complicated manuscript with all sorts of commentary, and 90% of the work in this is done by undergraduates who don't have a BA, who immerse themselves in working with, I would have thought it was impossible, this incredibly complicated manuscript, scholastic Greek. It's impossible with it, but they did it because it was so interesting, because the images are available anywhere in the world. What do you do with them? And so there is this, every artifact now has a different meaning than it has if it's just a sigillum, part one of a sigilla at the beginning and a few readings. And so what these artifacts, what the changes, we don't know yet, but clearly it's big. And a question, again, is this global, the politics. Perhaps my favorite, one of my favorite projects is what we're calling Open Persian, because I have 3 Iranian PhD students. And as an American, I have this desire to go, I really want to go to the holy city of Qom and give a lecture in Persian. Just go meet my colleagues there. I worked up so I can actually give a lecture in bad Arabic. And I loved going, in Cairo and saying, "Nahnu ulama," we scholars, or whatever, we can figure this out. And this idea that if you go talk to the scholars of various places, say, "Oh, these politicians are crazy." We understand each other. I think I found very effective. I don't know how it works in China. I loved my favorite scene in the film The Martian, which I thoroughly enjoyed, because it's optimistic American, get stuff done, no bad guys. But the Chinese scientists come in and save the day. They say, "Well, we're scientists, we're all in this together, we're going to give away all these secrets and save this American thing." I'm sure it's a fantasy and it's all idealization, but I thought it was, for once we had a nice fantasy. And I think that we do have this element. All the feedback I get from Iran is that there are lots of people who want to talk to us, and I can actually pronounce Persian as opposed to Arabic. So if I could actually do a little bit of Persian, it would be awesome. And how do you get past the colonial thing? Well, I see our students in Germany and the United States reading classical Persian with people in Iran. Because I live on video conferences. There's no reason you can't do it. And if we read classical Persian, maybe they will read classical Greek. Because it's not going to be the center periphery, you read our stuff. I think if you start to have it, actually have voices going back and forth, and if people who are elsewhere are speaking in their own voices, I think we get past a lot of the issues of Orientalism, which are tied to power. And I don't know if you see that, any inklings or glimmerings of that in your various aspects of work. I see a little bit. I'd like to see more. But I'm sort of naively optimistic in Arabic.